Welcome. You're listening to the Good Girls Don't podcast with Ashleigh Rae
and Verity Mansfield.
This is the podcast where we smash those rules that we've been taught to follow both as men and women and burn the damn rule book. We're tackling the big issues and the issues nobody wants to talk about, and we'll be fiercely feminist about it.
This podcast is about inspiration, education, compassion, and being the change that you need to see in this world. This podcast is for the trailblazers, the freedom fighters, and the soul igniters, and all the women just like you who are ready to break the good girl rules and be heard.
We acknowledge the traditional custodians of Australia and its First Nations people on which this podcast is produced and consumed. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging.
Get ready for the revolution. It's coming to you now. It's coming to you now. We're gonna sing it, revolution. And they'll never bring us down. No, they'll never bring us down.
Verity, hi.
Long time no speak, Ashleigh.
It has been a couple of weeks since we last spoke.
So it has, Ashleigh. So what are we actually going to chat about today? Because this is it's a really important conversation. And I think one that
We say that every
people-
episode, you know that.
I know. Everything is an important conversation between us. But this is something that, we don't talk about. And I mean, you've been a part of a court case for 3 years, and we've only just learnt this stuff. And it's really quite fascinating when we do look at the sentencing and also, all the issues that go on around the Sex Offender Registry.
Yep. It's really fascinating to unpack and try to understand what that is and all of the issues around it. Again, it's something that I only ever saw like on A Current Affair or Today Tonight, like when they ran a story on it every 6 months or so before my court case. And it's something that I've started to become more and more familiar with as my court case has progressed.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, I guess, that, we're not really taught about, um, and you don't really know unless it's actually relevant to your life. And I think it's really important just to let everyone know that the case we are talking about took place in Victoria, Australia. And so the rules and the legislation that we discuss or that we're referring to on this episode are solely based on Victorian law, on the state law of Victoria. And so that means that they may not be relevant to any other state or territory in Australia. So if you are in another state or territory, just know that they all have their own policies, they all differ, and we really do urge you to research your own state and territories legislation and policy around sentencing and the Sex Offender Registry.
Yeah, and chances are that they're probably very similar, with there'll be like those one or two key differences that make it uniquely that of New South Wales or WA.
Yeah, but a lot of the differences will be in the age brackets that they include certain things on, and that's actually, while it can seem small, it can actually massively impact someone's life. Like if you're under 13 in one state, you'll be safe from something else, but if you're over 13, then you're exposed to, a whole different, I guess, way of being sentenced or treated. So it's really important just to be aware of the ages within your state and to have conversations. Like this whole episode is going to show you how important it is to have this conversation in your house, especially if you have children, because you need to educate your children on what consent is in sexual relationships and know what the consequences are for your child based on their age. So if you've got children 10 years plus, I would seriously be taking note of this conversation. And especially if you've got boys, and I'm not saying that to be sexist, but I'm just saying that in the way that we raise boys to be boys, we've let them get away with so much shit. And over the last few years, with so many different changes in the legal system, males are being asked to be more accountable for sexual violence, for rape. The idea of consent is getting more narrowed and focused. So it's becoming easier for women to step up and say, you've done something wrong and I'm going to make you accountable. So I do really feel, and Ashley, I don't know what your opinion on this, but I do feel it's really, really strongly that we need to make our boys understand the consequences of their actions.
1 million squillion percent. I mean, I wouldn't have gone through this whole process of holding someone to public account if I didn't believe that.
Yeah, yeah. So let's jump in and have this conversation then. So the last time we spoke about your court case, and if you haven't listened to the previous episode before this, maybe just stop, hit pause, and go listen to the previous one so you know exactly what we're talking about. In a nutshell, Ashley's just spent the last 3 years holding, I don't know what the word is, holding this specific man accountable for sexual assault and rape as a child, as a 13, 14-year-old girl. And Ashley was, I guess, I was going to say lucky, but it's not lucky. The statute of limitations got dismissed, and that really enabled Ashley to be able to take control and to have some power back in her life and to hold somebody accountable. And so, the last episode, we really spoke about the process that she went through in order to, you know, from reporting the crime and then having to do all the interviews, going through the legal system, and then getting to the end of the hearing. Um, and I
Yeah.
think when we recorded, it was you hadn't had the sentencing, had you?
No, we were like right in between the plea hearing and the sentencing. Like we were like, there was less than a week in between those hearings, which is highly unusual. So because of coronavirus, the courts are operating very differently right now, and they're starting to reopen a little bit in Victoria. But
Yeah. So
basically, yeah.
you'd had the plea hearing where he was found he was guilty.
So the plea hearing is where they formally enter a plea and they can decide to do not guilty or guilty. And
Yeah.
he had pled he had pled guilty, and then they enter mitigating factors. So that's where they basically plead their case for mercy.
Yeah. And then
Um,
that's where we ended up with the interview, and then now you've had the sentencing.
yeah, so last time we spoke, I was super overwhelmed with everything. And we had almost no time in between. So normally there's like a couple of months between plea hearing and sentencing. We didn't have that
Wow.
luxury.
That's crazy to think. Yeah. I
Yeah.
I don't know how I feel about that. I would assume that you would want the sentencing close to the plea hearing.
Yes and no. Um,
Like, what does that person get to do for those 3 months in between? If they're found guilty of a crime, do they just get to chill at home?
well, it depends on the nature of the crime. Obviously, if there's someone who really is a violent threat to the community, then they're probably held in remand.
Yeah.
Um,
And then does that time then get taken off their official sentence? Like if
it,
they've
I
already
mean,
served
it's
3 or 6
possible.
months?
It
Yeah.
can, but not always. But in my case, like he goes about his life day to day. He waits. We had less than a week from plea hearing to sentencing, which is again highly unusual. And I was, quietly banking on having a few appointments with my therapist in between those hearings.
Yeah.
Didn't have that luxury. So we went forward with sentencing less than a week later. And now we are beyond that. We're like a full month almost after sentencing as we're recording.
I can't imagine being in that in between period. One, as I don't know if this is the right word, the perpetrator, and thinking, shit, I've got no idea what's going to happen to me. Like, I've been found guilty of XYZ. and now I've got to wait 3 months possible to know what this means, what the consequences are. Or like for yourself of having to sit there, I mean, you only had the week, but for someone who is in your position, if they did have to sit there for 3 months and go, oh my God, he's been found guilty, but then that, I would think there would be such anxiety waiting for 3 months to find out the justice part of it. Like, are you, yes, you've
Yeah.
been found guilty, but then what? Like, how, where are the consequences? What's going to happen? So
I
yeah,
mean,
it's so fascinating.
yeah, and look, I learned so much about our legal system and how it works, and had I had the honor of being able to be in touch with amazing social workers and solicitors and advocates who worked really hard to get me the best outcomes possible, and outcomes that I wanted and was comfortable with. And going through court during Corona was a unique experience, to say the least, that I'm partially thankful for and partially not, because it meant that there was no one allowed in the room. So I think I spoke last time about this, but no members of the public were allowed in, so no press. Not that I expected there to be a huge fanfare for my case, but no court reporters were allowed in, no general members of the public. Part of the way our legal system operates is that at this stage, at a plea hearing and at sentencing, any member of the public can come in and see justice being served. It's one of the foundational tenets of our legal system, that we can actually witness justice being served. But it also meant that no family members were really permitted. No support was allowed to really be there. So the offender was allowed to have their legal team physically present. My legal team were not allowed to be physically present. They dialed in via video link, which was a bit of a weird experience, if I'm honest. It was a bit strange. And I had a social worker with me from the Witness Assistance Service who are amazing. Those people deserve all of the funding and all of the trophies. But I actually had to apply to the court. I actually had to sort of argue with my solicitor a bit about having at least one other person physically present with me for support that day at sentencing. So, and the same thing at the plea hearing. I had to, apply to the court for my partner to be present with me. So that was a bit of a fun process to go through, worrying about whether or not I had the option of having someone that I knew. I had a social worker there who I really liked,
Yeah,
but
but
they're
having
not.
that personal person
Yeah,
with
having
their
someone that actually
support.
knows you and knows you
Yeah.
outside of the courtroom is really important.
Yeah, especially like when with the sentencing, like that would be surely the point when someone would need that support the absolute most.
Yeah, and the actual hearing itself moves really quickly. It's less than an hour if everyone's running on time.
Yeah.
So there were a couple of things in my case where I felt maybe proper reverence wasn't paid to what was about to take place. So I knew that the defense team, I found them to be a little bit unprofessional. I don't know, maybe for them this is normal and normal behavior, but for me I felt like gossiping and laughing about workplace stuff in the courtroom in front of me, the victim in this case, as the court would call me, and in front of their client waiting for the judge to
Yeah.
begin proceedings. I found that very unprofessional and very lacking in reverence for the offender's life who is about to radically change.
Yeah. Like it's a normal day for them, but this is a life-changing event for everyone else
Yeah,
involved.
yeah, and I found that really disrespectful.
Yeah.
So
So what happened in the sentencing hearing?
So in the hearing, the judge basically opens proceedings. You have to stand, you have to listen to them, give a little spiel about court being in session. You have to bow to the judge. They come in, they basically just make sure everyone's properly in attendance.
Yeah.
Everyone has to identify who they are. So the perpetrator has to say, yep, I'm here. Legal team has to identify themselves. And then the judge sort of goes over to make sure that they're still happy to plea, whatever the plea is. In my case, the perpetrator pled guilty. And then we move into the judge's remarks. So the judge's remarks are basically a summation of the case, basically a summation of what happened from my side, from their side, from what the legal teams have submitted. Um, it's a summary of everything that's taken place, high level summary. And at the end, they deliver the sentence. And the sentence in my case, he was sentenced to 200 hours of a community corrections order, or a CCO. 50 hours of that can be credited towards specialized sex offender therapy. I do not know what the proper term for that is. I just know that it's like a special kind of therapy that sex offenders can undergo. And he will be on the Sex Offender Registry for life.
For life. Now it's one of those things, isn't it? And I know, like, I don't want to jump into too much too quickly, and maybe we'll hold this question or go into this question a bit later. But there is a belief that once you're on the sex offender registry, you're on it for life. And maybe we'll just hold off for a bit later, because we'll have a chat about whether this is actually true or not. Um,
Yeah,
so how did you feel about the sentence handed down by the judge? Like, did you feel like justice was served? Did you feel the punishment fit the crime?
I felt in the moment I was really overwhelmed, and actually I stayed really overwhelmed by it for a couple of weeks and didn't really know how I felt. It's probably only in the last week-ish that I've started to unpack how I feel about it. And
Yeah.
um, my knee-jerk reaction is that I'm really angry about it,
Yeah.
because it doesn't recognize the personal injury. It doesn't recognize the personal nature of the crime. It's all about the community, which is not a bad thing, but it's missing the personal aspect of this.
You
The
mean being on the sex offender registry, or the
well, what I mean is that in the details of my case, there was some dispute as to whether or not a community corrections order would even be appropriate, because this person carries out in their regular course of their professional life activities that would sometimes be part of a community corrections order.
yeah.
And they were also considered to be a person of good character because they had no other criminal history.
Do you just want to quickly just go into what is a community corrections order?
Yeah, sure. Um, so this is basically where you're given community work to do, whether that's picking up rubbish in a park or you're cleaning graffiti. It's just community service. So
And what's the point of it? Like, why have sex offenders doing community service?
I think there's probably more eloquent answers for this, but I think it's really just to show that they're making some sort of amends.
Amends.
Yeah, and it
And this is
prevents
where you're
people going
saying,
to jail.
yeah. So this is what you're saying, I guess, in terms of it doesn't feel personal. Like everything, like what this guy received was he's got to give back to the community and like make amends with the community, which he didn't offend the community, he offended you. And second of all, being on the register the sex offenders registry, getting tongue tied, is more about how things impact him and the community again. But it doesn't, there's no reconciliation of what's happened to you. There's no
Yeah,
being held emotionally accountable to
yeah,
you as
yeah,
a individual person. There's no, like, if we all know like in our normal lives, if you hurt somebody else, you kind of expect the other person to apologize, but they do something specifically for you. Like, if, my partner pissed me off and then he went and helped the neighbor cut down a tree, I would be like, well, great, you've done something for the community, but what's that got to do with me?
What's that got to do with the beef between you and I?
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's really how I felt. Like, yes, this is great, but you've also just made the argument that he already does this in the normal course of his professional life. So this really isn't a punishment. It's also not a deterrent.
Yeah.
So what is this?
What's the point?
Yeah, what is the point of this? And 200 hours, it's not a lot. Especially considering the time delay of reporting and the length.
How long does he have to do that 200 hours in? Like, is that
18
200 hours in a
months.
year? How many?
18 months.
In 18 months.
So, I mean, look, it's a fair bit in 18 months. He's got to do a couple of hours a week. He's got to do it like, at least 2.5 to 3 hours a week.
So if you divide 200 hours by 7.5 hours, it's just below an average work day. That's like 27 days of community service in
Yeah.
in a year and a half.
Yeah, yeah. So look, it's not a lot. And the other thing for me that really came into this was that this was obviously something that took place when I was a child, when I was 13, 14. I'm almost 30 now. So literally for half of my life, this has been a huge impact.
Yeah.
Whether I've been cognizant of that or not. And this punishment handed out by the judge does not feel like an adequate sentence. So what I would say is, I don't feel like justice was served, but I do feel like accountability was.
Yeah.
So I got public accountability. He will have to do this. He will have to, do all these things that the judge tells them to do. And he is monitored by the judge. He has to report back to them in a few months' time to check in and see how things are progressing. And he'll have to do that throughout the course of the sentence. But beyond that, like, there's a lot of what was handed out was about community protection. There was not a lot about me and making amends with me.
Yeah.
And that's where I get a little bit upset.
Yeah, and that's fair enough. It makes absolutely total sense.
Yeah. It's a big thing. And one of the things that I've decided to do, or to explore doing, is because there was no room for a personal amends within the legal process. So even if we wanted to, there's no room for it. The justice system actually doesn't have the tools within its scope to do this. So they can't order you to say sorry. And honestly, who wants an insincere apology? If you're forced to do it by a judge, it's not sincere.
Yeah.
It's probably not going to be sincere. So you have to kind of do this off your own back. So I'm actually currently exploring the possibility of restorative justice, which is a mediation process where we can talk about the things that weren't able to be said in the courtroom. And we can ask questions. We can say things to each other, and it's a very heavily
But it's personable. It's like more, it's not a clinical, I guess, legal process. Then it becomes almost like a therapeutic, personal
that's what it is.
conversation.
It's like getting
Yeah.
closure. This is a bit grim, but I kind of liken it to when someone dies, you have all of those questions that you can never ask, and this is like having that opportunity returned to you.
Yeah.
So you get to ask questions, you get to say things, you get to express yourself. And for me, I've got certain aims that I'm looking to achieve from that process. Both parties have to be willing, because this is not part of the legal process.
Yeah.
And it is a long process as well, because there's a lot of preparation that goes into this. Like, it's there to be restorative, not destructive.
Yeah.
So there has to be not only does everyone have to be willing, but you also have to be able and ready to do this kind of process.
Yeah, it sounds absolutely massive, like on an emotional level. So,
Huge.
what does it mean then to be on the sex offender registry? He's going to be on that for life. So, what does that mean for him?
So for him, that means that within 2 days of sentencing, he had to report all of his information to the police and basically go through the intake process of getting onto the registry.
And what kind of information, like, do
So
you know what kind of information that involves?
yeah, so these are things like, your basic stuff, like your name, your date of birth, where you live, your employer. So you have to list where you work for everything. Um,
Do you know if the employer gets notified?
I don't know if employers get notified. I'm really not sure on that one.
Yeah.
Um, it's also any children that are part of your life regularly. So whether that's your own children or your brother's kids or your nieces and
Yeah,
nephews,
wow.
your friends' kids that you have regular contact with. Now this is very much dependent on the situation because there's obviously going to be some people who are not allowed to have contact with any children
Yeah.
whatsoever. But let's say it's on the milder end, like in my case, they've got to register the children that they come into contact with regularly. So he has children, they'll be listed as people that he has regular contact with. For some people as well, it also means that they can't live or work near places where children congregate. So that's things like schools, scout halls, sports facilities,
So he would have to
parks.
move house if he lived near a school.
Yeah. So,
Wow.
yeah. And I mean, look, I am not 100% clear on the exact stipulations of his registry conditions. I have been told that while we have the blanket restrictions,
Mm-hmm.
it is also taken into account the circumstances of each case because it's not appropriate to say that every sex offender cannot have contact with children at all.
Yeah.
Which we'll get into why later, but it's not necessarily appropriate for everyone. So it's possible that that could be a stipulation for him, I'm not sure, but it's also restrictions on travel and how you travel. So the government, beyond the normal letting the government know, registering your stuff with DFAT when you travel overseas, you also have to notify the police if you're going overseas and when you come back. You have to hand in your
Yeah.
passport as proof that you went and you came back.
So you can go overseas.
I mean,
Or
yes,
again, does
but
that depend on the
that also depends on the other country, whether they're willing to take you
yeah.
with your history.
Like you have to get a visa, you'd have to fill that information out.
Exactly. If you change jobs, new employer has to go on the register. You buy a new car, that all has to be registered with the police. Any electronic equipment, so mobile phones, computers, PlayStations, all of those things have to be registered with police. Your social media handles, any chat room usernames that you
Wow.
have, all have to be registered with the police. And the idea is that this is there to help prevent further offending or to assist in any investigations
Yeah.
so that they've got information. They can, the idea is that it's easier for police to join the dots in any other investigation. So if they uncover a ring, they can go to this person and say, oh, we know that you're connected to this one because we have them all on a list.
Yeah.
I need to take a breath. Whew.
It's so fascinating, isn't it? It's just
It is fascinating. And look, there are cases where this radically is going to change someone's life where they probably can't have Maybe they can have their own children at home and that's not a problem, but they can't take their children to birthday parties or
Or
sports
go watch their kids play sport.
or
Yeah.
to school fetes. They can't do those kinds of things with their
Or
kids, or they can't
yeah,
take
go
them
to
to
their
the
daughter's
park.
ballet recital, or go to a school assembly, or watch their kids get awards at award nights.
Exactly. So, I mean, it is really detrimental, and that is what it means on a very personal level for people who are on the register. And it's not just dudes who are on there, by the way, too. There are probably a few women.
Yeah, I mean, because we do hear a lot of stories about female teachers that get caught into, sexual relations with male students. So there would definitely be females on there, at least for that.
Exactly.
Um, but it's so incredible, I guess, to understand like what it actually means for the perpetrator to be on a sex offender registry,
Yeah.
because our kids, you know, and this is when kids can get on the registry. And I think this is where something we need to stop thinking that this is just adults, or that we don't have a responsibility. Like, oh, well, I'm not a man who's going to commit a sex crime, so I don't need to worry about this. Or I'm not a female who's going to commit a sex crime, so I don't need to worry about this. But if you've got a parent and you've got kids growing up, and the access that they do have to porn, the sexting that goes on, the sending nude photos, and all of that stuff that goes on now, more than any other generations. Like before this current, it's not been that long. It's only been, God, maybe like a good 10 plus years that children have had access to all of this digital, exposure, that's
Yeah.
allowed more sex crimes to happen. And so, as parents, we really need to step up. We really need to be aware of what our children could be looking at if they get involved in a sex crime. We really need to start looking at protecting our children, teaching them about consent, and not just protecting them from being abused, protecting them from being an abuser. Because it is so easy now to fall into that trap, and then to end up getting punished, having a record, being on the registry, and having your whole entire life change because you made a stupid mistake. Or there was a case as well that happened where there was a young guy who had just turned 18, and he received nude photos from a girl he just met on Tinder. And those photos were found by the parents that she'd sent them on a phone to this guy. They reported to the police, and it turned out she'd lied about her age on Tinder and was actually underage. And then he got charged. He didn't ask for the photos. They had never had sex. She just sent them to him without consent from him. And now he's on the sex offenders list. And that's just so, there's it's such a fine line in some cases. Like, is it fair for that young man to have part of his life ruined, limited, to have his rights, um, what's the word I'm looking for?
Squashed.
Squashed, restricted, because he got tricked into something that he actually had no control over. So I think it's so important that if you are listening to this and you have children, that you really do think about the consequences of what can happen. And like I said, not just worry about whether your children, could be abused, but if your child becomes an abuser. And I think one of the really important things that came up this week in social media, and we spoke about this with a previous episode with Holly Ann Martin, was that stranger danger. Like, most people are not getting raped by strangers hiding in bushes, or sexually abused by strangers hiding in bushes. It only makes up for a really small amount, like something crazy like 6% of cases that are reported. Yes, most of the time it is someone that you know in the family, someone that is known to the family, that commits these offences. But there's a massive, massive proportion of peer-to-peer sex abuse that goes on. And this is why, if you are a parent listening to this, you need to listen, you need to sit up, you need to take notice, because we need to be able to educate our children. They are so exposed, they are so vulnerable, because of the society that we currently live in, because of the access to digital media, because of the access to porn, because of the access to people pretending to be other children. And there's computer games where our kids can play with strangers and you don't know who's on the other side.
Yeah, it's rampant and it's so easy to fall
It is
prey to that.
easy. It's
It's
easy to get
it's
involved in a sex crime. And so we need to prevention. So getting back on track,
yeah.
what's the what's the actual aim of the Sex Offenders Registry?
Well, the aim of it is accountability first of all. It is a means of holding people to account and checking and monitoring how people are going, because not everybody that gets onto the sex offender registry is a good person who made an awful mistake a long time ago. A lot of people who are on there as well are also repeat offenders. You have
Mm.
you have people who do some pretty
Yeah,
awful
you
and
have
vile
both
things.
extremes on there.
You have both extremes. So the point is there to monitor how they're going, to identify if it's also like a risk management. So not just to monitor how they're going, but identify if there's any risky behavior going on and things that need to
Yeah.
be sussed out. So
So there's an aim about reducing that chance of
yeah,
reoffending.
so there is a component of recidivism there as well. It's also about helping people, not helping, sorry, I'm going to get my words mixed up. There's a lot of words today, guys. I've had some really big long conversations. um, there's also a component of assisting with further investigations that may
Yeah,
happen now
definitely.
or in the future. So if you have this information now, not only are you able to monitor these people, um, but you're also that much easier able to conduct an investigation that they might not be at the center of, they might be on the peripheries of. Like, I don't know, maybe like an example I think of, is I'm getting all criminal mindsy here, guys, is if you have a sex offender with all of their stuff registered and they happen to know Joe Blow in another state from an online forum who's mentioned that they've committed some crime, and it's assistive for the police to be able to say, hey, this person from that forum, um, we're going to investigate your connection to them and see if we can use it and how we can use it to locate this person and the victim.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's so many different ways that this can be used in investigations. So it's sort of a two-pronged approach of keeping track of these people, also because sex offending is a crime that really relies on silence and people not
Yeah.
saying anything, and it's very shadowy. This stops that. This helps to stop that, and it brings it into the light and
Yeah.
holds people accountable. The other thing that I didn't mention earlier that I should have, not only is it about registering all of these different things with a police station, it's also you have to be able to comply with reasonable requests for property searches on a regular basis. So police come to your home, they search your house to make sure that you're not hiding anything from them, like extra electronic devices that you haven't registered. They can search your electronic devices to make sure that you haven't got all of these extra usernames that you haven't told them about. Um, they hold you accountable, and you have to be able to, you're subjected to that if you're on there.
Yeah. And I guess as well, one of the other really important things is it stops these people, sex offenders, from being able to work in child-related employment.
Yeah, and this is the big thing. You're on this register, you cannot get a working with children check.
Yeah.
And you can't work in or around schools. So look, a lot of people just think that means you can't be a teacher, but this sort of played out in my case because the person in question sometimes does work with schools. I want to be very clear here, not directly with students and the students are not at risk
Yeah.
from this person. But they do contract work with some schools sometimes. Um, let's think about the different kinds of contractors that you have at schools. You have cleaning staff, you have people who come in and
Gardeners.
run excursions, you have
Yeah.
the lollipop lady or dude. There's so many different people that can come and go from a school. So it's not just about the teachers, it's everyone else that can work in and around that school.
Yeah. It's really interesting. Like, when you start really understanding, I guess, the impact that being on the sex offenders registry can have. And there's 4 different levels, isn't there? Like, in terms of the registry. Like, it's not like everyone's just lumped together. Like, I think they call them classes. Like, there's 4 different classes of offences or something.
Yeah, there's 4 different classes, and basically it's divided into 2 areas. So class 1 and class 2 relate to offending against children, and class 3 and 4 relate to adults.
Right.
So class 3 and 4 are adult to adult offending. So that's someone over the age of 18 has done something with someone else over the age of 18.
Yeah.
In my case, this person was found guilty of, see, now I've forgotten because a little bit of time's passed. You would think I'd remember this, but they were found guilty of 2 class 2 offences and 1 class 1, I think.
Yeah.
I might get that wrong. And there are rules about how sentencing works with this. So in Victoria, we have rules about how long you're on the register for based on where your offending falls within these classes.
Yeah.
So you can only be on the register for 8 years and then you're off. No big deal. 8 years, you're done. And for a long time, we thought that's what was going to happen. We thought he was only going to be on it for 8 years, and I thought that was absolute bullshit. If I'm honest, not angry at all about that. And we were shocked to discover that this would be a lifelong thing for the offender. We didn't
Yeah.
think it was going to be, and then suddenly it was, and we looked into it and like, oh, well, that makes sense. So he'll be on this for life, and every year you have to go in and update your details, make sure everything is in order, that your car registration is all hunky-dory. So at least once a year they have to go and do this.
Yeah. And so I'm just like going back to their classes, because I think they're quite important to
Yeah,
have a look
sure.
at. And the class 1 offences, like um
So class 1 offences are like sexual penetration of a child. That includes rape, incest, penetration of a child under 16, sexual penetration of a child 16 or 17-year-old, sexual penetration of a person with a cognitive impairment by providers of medical or therapeutic services, sexual penetration of a person with cognitive impairment by providers of special programs. So these are people like your carers and support workers. And
yeah.
I think it is so amazing that we've got that covered in this, by the way.
And detailed. Yeah, I mean, there's some things that are really detailed on there, and these are the other ones that I'm so glad are on there, like persistent sexual abuse of a child outside of Australia, sexual intercourse or other sexual activity with a young person outside Australia where the offender is in a position of trust or authority. Like, it's so, going through this, it makes you realize, like, wow, you could actually charge a person with that. Oh my God, like, yes, that is a serious enough crime
Yeah.
to charge someone with. So that the first class is really interesting because it does talk about a lot of the more, like, I guess, kind of hardcore stuff. Like, you were saying, like, sexual penetration, persistent sexual abuse, just being, if you're facilitating sexual offences against a child, aggravated sexual servitude, sexual intercourse or other sexual activity with a child outside Australia. And I'm so glad to see that kind of stuff is in there. And then in class 2, it's interesting because it talks more about sexual assault of a child.
Yeah, so it talks a
Um,
lot more about how, I don't want to say this to offend people, but we do need to look at sexual violence on a spectrum where
yeah.
some stuff, is, for lack of a better term, perhaps milder in
It's like you can
nature.
be sexual assaulted and not raped.
Yes,
So,
yes.
they and I
So,
think that's the whole point of the registry and having the separate classes is that, people who do the more extreme end of shit get more extreme punishment.
yes, exactly. So, like a class 2, examples of that includes the sexual assault of a child, sexual assault by compelling sexual touching against a child, assault with intent to commit sexual offense against a child, threat to commit a sexual offense against a child,
Yeah.
you know, pos-
Indecent acts, like just exposing yourself to a child.
yeah,
Grooming. I'm so glad. Like, who would have thought that you could actually just charge someone with grooming for sexual conduct of a child under the age of 16? And this is where I think it's really important that this is Victorian legislation and regulations and law. So if you're in another state, these ages may be very different. So
yeah,
it is so important to actually understand what is on um, your like what your state has said.
yeah. And keeping in mind that as well, I think as a parent, it's really, I'm not a parent, but I can speak from what I wish my parents had known about. I wish my parents had been more aware. Um, and known about the age issues and maybe been more proactive in preventing this from taking place. And keeping in mind as well that laws do change, and this is something that you have to stay on top of. Like every year or two, you need to check this stuff, because legislation changes. In
Yeah.
Australia, in Victoria, we just had this law come in within the last 5 years that now means historical sex crimes can now be prosecuted. That is huge. I mean, can you imagine, like, if nobody knew about that? Like, we have to check this stuff all the time. Um,
Yeah.
Oh, the other thing that I want to add here about class 2, causing or inducing a child to take part in sex work. I'm so glad stuff like this, and possession of child pornography. Um, we've talked really briefly about this, but these are things like possessing nude photos, if kids are sending those to each other.
Or even procuring them, like being able to provide them for someone else, being in possession, producing them, like all of that stuff is so important.
It absolutely does. So we then move into the classes 3 and 4. Um, Class 3 and 4 is a little bit different because it deals with adult to adult offending. Um, so that's again sexual penetration, compelling sexual penetration, indecent assault, assault with intent to rape, indecent act with a person with a cognitive impairment by providers of medical or therapeutic services or providers of special programs, abduction or detention, procuring sexual penetration by threats or fraud, and sexual servitude. Um, I want to talk about the time that people are on the sex offender register. So, this is again to reiterate, this is just for Victoria, okay? So, please, if you are curious, you need to check this in your own state or territory. And it's worth having this in the back of your head if you're a parent or if you're involved
Yeah.
with children, like if you're a teacher or, I don't know, you work with kids, whatever. um, if you're found guilty of one class 2 offence, you're on there for 8 years. If you're found guilty of one class 1 offence or found guilty of 2 class 2 offences, you're on there for 15 years.
Wow.
15 years. That's a long time. If you're found guilty of 2 or more class 1 offences, and then you're found guilty of a class 1 offence or more class 2 offences. So basically, if you've got like a class 1 and then like 2 class 2s or 2 class 1s and a class 2, wow, numbers are getting confusing. You're on there for life.
Yeah.
You're on there forever. There is a really interesting caveat to this. If you're a child offender, these amounts are halved. I mean, you can't halve forever, but if you're found guilty of a class 2 offence, you're only on there for 4 years.
Yeah.
If you're found guilty of a class 1 and a class 2, you're only on there for 7.5 years.
Yeah.
And if the, oh, hang on, I've just found the caveat for the forever bit. If you are found guilty of 2 or more class 1 offences, and the class 2, like the last one where we talked about it being for life, that is put down to 7.5 years instead of forever
Wow.
if you're a child. Yeah, it's huge. And there are consequences for not complying with the conditions of the registry as well. You can go to jail for
Yeah, which is good.
it. I mean, yes and no. It depends how. I know that in America, there are a lot of places where it is very difficult to comply with things like this. It's purposely made very difficult. So I have a bit of empathy there, but yeah, and jail's not always appropriate for everybody.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating, I guess, concept, the whole, idea of this registry, and what it really does entail, and all the ins and outs of it. I think it's kind of crazy that it's so different in every single state. Like, you would have thought something as criminal as, you know, pedophilia should be dealt with at a national level. Do you know what I mean? Like, no wonder people are so confused about things. No one knows what to do, what's reportable. It's just crazy that it's just so different in each state.
Yeah, it's a bit nuts. And I was thinking about this before we were talking, and I think, or at least I'd like to think, that part of the reason that every state and territory is different is because every state and territory has a different type of population that deals with issues, a little bit differently. As in, where I live is one of the most populous states in the country versus the Northern Territory. Victoria is predominantly white. We have a lot of migrants. And we're a very metropolitan, very cosmopolitan place. But if you go to somewhere like Northern WA or the Northern Territory, the population is a very different kettle of fish with very different resources available.
Mm.
So I hope that that's one of the reasons that it's so different. But otherwise, I can't really think of why that's not more
Of why it
standardized.
wouldn't be standardized. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And it's really fascinating. Like, I never realized that children could be on the register. Um, I think that's the really important thing, that we really need to be aware of. Because who wants their child to end up, making very ill-informed decision and ending up on the Sex Offenders Registry and having possibly their entire life affected.
Yeah, and I mean, think about this. If you are, something that I thought about a lot is, if you are called out and held accountable for something that you did when you were younger, like in my case, you have a family already, maybe your kids are toddlers that are a little bit older. think about what that means for being able to take your family on a holiday.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't take them camping where there's going to be other families. You can't take them to a caravan park or to a resort. Um, I mean, the idea is that children have a right to be safe pretty much wherever, and they shouldn't have
And
to
to be children.
restrict. Yeah, and their
Yeah.
lives shouldn't have to be restricted because of your actions. But that has some really detrimental
Yeah.
effects for
And I
your
mean, if you're
yeah.
if you're a child and you're under 18 and you send your boyfriend or girlfriend who is 18 or over, so you could be 17 or 16, and there's a lot of sexually active 16-year-olds. There's a lot of sexually active 14-year-olds out there. So if they send, their boyfriend or girlfriend a photo of themselves, or even caught sexting, that they could be found guilty of possessing child pornography and placed on the Sex Offenders Registry.
Yeah, and let's think about what that means for them being able to attend school.
Yeah. Or
Um,
university.
being
And
able to actually finish an education, and I mean, getting their first jobs, going on schoolies, or just doing normal young people-y things. Oh my
yeah.
God, I feel so old saying that.
But this is really important. And I do love this about Victoria. And I wish every state had this. But Victoria actually has a website called Respect Me, Don't Sext Me. And it literally provides a kit for family, friends, teachers, workers, young people. Um, it's like an education pack designed. It is actually designed for schools to deliver to 11 and 14-year-olds. So this is why we're saying, like, we're not being ridiculous or over dramatic by saying if you have young children as young as 10 plus, you need to be having these conversations with them. You need to be teaching your daughters not to get their older boyfriends into trouble, like illegally. And we need to be teaching our boys not to, like, to have that situational awareness. Like, we teach girls constantly, about not wearing, not putting themselves into dangerous positions. Don't wear skirts that are too short. Don't look like a slut. Don't go out in public at night by yourself. Go to the
How
toilet
about
with
we
your
teach our
parents.
children not to be
We don't
predators?
we don't teach boys this shit. We don't teach them to have situational awareness. And now we have, and it was a classic case where Liz Ellis, who was an Australian netballer, is she a netballer?
Yeah, I think so.
Netball, basketball, something to do with balls. And, there was a lot of stuff going on in the rugby league and that about or in rugby and in football, about men that were getting caught up in sex scandals and rape scandals and domestic violence scandals and accusations that were they true, were they not true, and the as players who were getting paid a shitload of money, being men, um, were getting into trouble and couldn't play their sport, couldn't earn an income, were having their contracts suspended while they were caught up in these court cases. And the men were complaining, saying, but we're actually innocent. And I'm sure some of them were. Um, and Liz
But
Ellis made
again,
a really profound
hashtag not all
statement.
men.
Yeah, not all men. But Liz Ellis made a really fantastic statement where she said, if situational awareness is good enough for us women, it's good enough for you men. Like, you can't get yourself into trouble because you're making stupid decisions and then go cry in the corner when you get caught up in something and just go, well, I didn't know. Well, it's not good enough. You have to know. You have to be educated. And there is so much education out there, available free education. There's a brilliant website called Culture Reframed that have a free porn education program for parents to help parents, to educate parents on how to educate children about porn. It's a free program. There is nothing stopping any human being from educating themselves about what consent is, what rape is, how to prevent it, how to, as much as possible prevent it. Like, someone jumps out of a bush at you, there's probably not much you can do. But you get my point, though. Like, the prevention is so much better than having to go through like what you went through, Ashleigh. Like if parents had been more informed in the past, and especially like in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, there was so many cases of sexual abuse that went unreported, and it was kind of a thing like, oh yeah, well next time you just got to look out for yourself a bit better. It wasn't even taken seriously. But there's just no excuse anymore for ignorance around sexual violence.
No, there's not with the number of awareness campaigns that we have. And, I'm crunching some numbers on this now. Um, and I'm going to say, for off the top of my head and off the top of my memory, sexual violence specifically, so that's rape, indecent assault, anything to do, sexy crimes, um, that cost the Australian economy, that cost us taxpayers 22 billion annually.
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about this budget surplus in our politics. If you want to plug a hole in our economy, then you need to fix sexual and domestic violence. That is costing us so much every year.
It's insane, isn't it?
It's crazy how much it costs us. And,
And the
you
politicians
know,
don't take it seriously.
they don't. And I suspect that number's actually higher because there's a lot that can't be accounted for. Um, I'm trying to figure out if there's a way that I can actually calculate the exact cost of my case from the time when it happened right up till now and then projecting forward. So that includes not that includes like missed opportunity because I was too unwell to participate in education or employment. So there's like lost productivity. There's quality of life costs. There's the impacts are detrimental and lifelong to the survivor. And we need a way to calculate this and quantify it so that we can actually do something about it and know where we need to plug the holes.
Yeah.
What a rant. Do you feel better? I feel a bit better.
Yeah, it's just so fascinating. And I just still think there's so much research that's needed by everyone. Like you're in Victorian, I'm in WA. And I find it really interesting. Like I've been trying to Google the information about the sex registry in WA and I
Mm.
can't find it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we should talk about one thing before we wrap up, which is whether sex offender registry should be public or not.
That is one thing I have been able to find. There are websites that do detail where Australian sex offenders are living.
I didn't
I
realize that
don't think
was
it goes
public.
specifically into, I'm just opening it up right now. I don't think it specifically goes into their actual address. Um, but there is a site called, well, there's a site, I'm going to put it out there because I don't think we should get caught into the legalities or the ethics of how to find this information. But it does have their full names. It has who posted it. It has the age of the person. It has the location in terms of like Perth, WA. It has the offence. So the one I'm looking at the moment pleaded guilty to possessing child exploitation material. The sentence to 9 months in prison. So, I don't think this was just a small little thing. Suspended for 12 months and a supervision and program requirement. Um, there's previous sex convictions, child sex convictions in 2005, which they received sentencing of 12 months in jail. A reportable offender been convicted 5 times for failing to comply with his reporting. Um, so I don't know about other states that might have access to information. I'm just actually going to click on another It actually has a list of states at the side of it. So yeah, there are. Even though there's information in each state. There's ones here for Victoria
Do you
as
think this
well.
should be publicly available information?
Oh, it's so hard to say because if they're a serious sex offender, I feel like you should know. You should know if there's someone in your street. If you've got, like, my children are allowed to play on the street. So yeah, I fucking want to know if one of my neighbors, I need to, like, you can't play with that neighbor because my kids play with my neighbors. And the neighbors come out and they kick balls with all the kids in the street. It's so lovely. But I would want to know if one of those people um, had, raped a woman or a child. Um, yeah, I'd want to know. I don't know if that answers whether it's ethical. I mean, we don't, and I don't know. I don't know. Do we hear stories of pedophiles being murdered for being pedophiles? Have we heard about gangs going around and shooting these people? I don't know.
I
I don't.
mean, we've certainly heard stories of how they're treated in prison being
Yeah,
quite horrific. And I think there's the concern that that treatment carries over into public life.
yeah,
Um, Something that I worry about with this information being public is a lot of sex offending takes place between people known to each other.
yeah,
So if you identify the perpetrator, you also put a target on the back of everyone that they know or ever had
yeah.
contact with, and you can possibly very quickly and easily identify the victim, and you put the victim in a really vulnerable position, and they don't deserve that. They've been through enough. um
And I think that's the thing, isn't it? It really, like, someone like the young guy that we talked about before who received without consent, um, basically pornography, like sexting from a girl who'd lied to him about the age. Yeah, he should not be, his name shouldn't be given to the public. He needs to be protected.
yeah, I think there has to be some rules and restrictions about who's named publicly. Look, I even don't know that naming and putting out there even the worst of the worst is a good idea, simply for the danger that that might
Yeah,
pose, not just to that person but to the community. We don't need a mob and pitchforks and tiki torches. We don't need that.
no,
It's a really interesting uh, discussion, and this is part of the reason I am choosing to explore restorative justice, is because for me, justice wasn't served in the courtroom, accountability was, and that's great. Um, but we have to start holding people accountable to being a better example.
yeah,
People have to learn to be better, to be different, and to be willing to call each other out and say, that's not on, mate. My greatest hope is that a lot of people who go through the process of court and go through restorative justice, is that perpetrators can then be an example to the people in their life and in their community and say, this is what you get if you fuck it up.
yeah,
And by the way, it's really not on. It's not just about you. It's about all of us. It's about the whole community.
yeah, absolutely.
Verity, do you feel like a cocktail?
Oh my God.
I feel like after that we need one.
Like an espresso martini or something.
Let's go get one. I'll just quickly jump on a plane. I'll be there in a few hours and we'll go get smashed. Like totally responsible adults. I think that wraps this episode up. What do you think?
Definitely. I think, yeah. It's such a massive conversation.
Okay. Well, we're going to leave it there with you guys. You guys sit in the corner and think about what we've said. I don't
But
know.
no, yeah, go have a look and try and find out in your own states what the regulations are about the Sex Offenders Registry,
Go
and
back and listen to the
just get
episode with
really
Holly Ann as
familiar.
well.
Yeah, go back and listen to Holly Ann's episode, especially.
She has
Um,
amazing resources for parents.
yeah,
She starts this education young. So, like, she does this with, I think, preps in grade ones. And, you know, she starts young with the education. She's got loads of resources that, are for parents and stuff that is for kids. So, check out her as well.
and this is, yeah, and I think as well, like I've just found some really interesting examples of why we need to be having this conversation with our children. And these are West Australian examples. So a 15-year-old boy takes a photograph of his genitals and emails it to some friends as a joke. He may technically be committing an offence under the WA Criminal Code of producing child exploitation material. It does not matter whether his face or any other identifying feature can be seen. It also doesn't matter whether or not the person receiving the image asked for it or is happy to receive the image. There's another example. A 14-year-old girl takes a video of herself performing a striptease and sends it to a group of girlfriends. She may technically, again, be committing an offence for distributing child exploitation material.
So you don't even have to be sexually deviant to end up on the register, guys.
And this is, you could just be exploring your sexuality with your girlfriends and it could be a crime. Any of the girlfriends who open and view the video, and sometimes you don't know what's in the video before you open it. So any of the girlfriends who open and view the video are also committing a crime. It does not matter if it is mutually acceptable joke or if she is fully or partly naked.
Yep.
And then this is the third example they've got on here. A 17-year-old couple take photos of themselves engaging in consensual sexual intercourse and then email the photos to themselves. They are technically committing a crime. It does not matter that they are old enough to have sex and that they only intend the images to be for each other. This type of sexting is still illegal. And I'm sorry, I am so positive there are hundreds, if not thousands, of 17-year-old couples that are doing that. And they don't know that it's a crime.
Amen. Yep. You've said it. Drop the mic moment. Let's go pour ourselves some cosmopolitans and margaritas.
And martinis.
Yeah, all of the things.
Yep, and we'll see all of you again next week on the Good Girls Go podcast. Hey, if you want to continue this conversation, head over to our Facebook page and be part of the revolution. You can find us at Good Girls Don't Podcast on Facebook. Please note we cannot create change alone. Your support, likes, comments, shares, and iTunes reviews help us to give a voice to the insanely inspirational women and the controversial issues that we discuss.
If you'd like to be a part of our podcast, or if you have an issue that you have a burning desire for us to bring into the light, please contact us. With fierceness, Ashleigh
and Verity.
Get ready for the revolution. It's coming to you now. It's coming to you now. You're witnessing an evolution. And they'll never bring us down. No, they'll never bring us down. Get ready for the revolution. saying